everyone, and welcome back to the Horizon Cloud Summit. So before starting, I will share a slide that I think most of you are getting familiar with. So there are some housekeeping rules for the session. The session will be recorded and published on the HCloud channels. And please mute yourself if you're not speaking. If you'd like to speak, please use your raise your hand button and wait for the moderator to let you speak. You can also post your questions in the Zoom chat, and we will look at that in the Q&A session. Also, please turn off your video, and if you have any technical issue, please contact the Zoom host or send us an email. All right, so I will introduce myself. So I'm Alessandra Massaro, and I work as a senior consultant at IDC. IDC is a member of the HCloud Consortium. And today I will be introducing this last session of the Horizon Cloud Summit, focusing on success stories, best practices, innovating through cloud adoption. So this morning, the discussion focused about the three key main areas of the EU data strategy and the European Green Deal, which are the cloud federation, cloud to edge continuum, and green IT. This afternoon, what we are going to do is to give voice to those initiatives who are implementing some best practices within the European cloud computing arena. So let's give a little bit of context and some trends which are describing the cloud computing market. IDC elaborated some trends that are related to the role of cloud in the emerging digital infrastructure. And as you can see from the image, from a technical point of view, we are moving towards a cloud-centric technology, both on-premise and on the public cloud, and to an autonomous operations in all the deployment options, both on edge, cloud, and core data centers. Thus, we are moving towards ubiquitous deployments of applications and also of code. So as you can see, this digital infrastructure ecosystem is underlying the whole IT and business operations. But it's not all about technology innovation. Also, governance and organizational structure are very much important in this context, and also the business success has a very great impact on company choices. So what we are doing within this context and taking into consideration these trends, we are trying to build up and to describe the Edge cloud landscape. We are doing this through different activities, the first two being the European Cloud Portfolio and the success stories and good practices guide. The European Cloud Portfolio has the main objective of mapping the European cloud computing research and innovation and deployment landscape. In the first release of the portfolio, we have profiled 111 initiatives, and we are working on developing a second release. The Success Stories and Good Practices Guide has the objective of identifying and describing within the portfolio and enriching the portfolio with more initiatives, those initiatives that represent some added value in what is considered state-of-the-art within the cloud computing community. So 65 initiatives have been identified through executive interviews during this last month, and we are working now on a second release. Those initiatives can provide actionable lessons learned in terms of business impact, technology innovation, organizational structure, data governance, and last but not least, environmental and sustainability performance. All the information that we are collecting will be integrated into an online catalog of relevant cloud-related initiatives, and this will be addressed to all relevant stakeholders that want to deepen their knowledge about what is actually happening within the European cloud computing arena. So this is very much important, the interaction that we have with the community and the learnings that we receive from the community. Although the activity is still ongoing, we have elaborated some preliminary findings, especially taking into consideration the 3 cloud strategic topics, so cloud federation, edge computing, and green IT. With regards to federations, the analysis we have completed so far has highlighted that the adoption and participation is a success factor within this topic. Of course, an increased number of users of federated or community services provoke a positive network effect. However, it has also been analyzed that the widespread adoption of this kind of initiative is still some obstacles, and some elements that can be considered as challenges are represented by organizational resistance and also the presence of competing companies within the environment. When it comes to edge computing, we have analyzed that business impact is an element that is very much present in the majority of the cases, underlying that many technology providers and end users organizations are looking at edge innovation to get business benefits. The main challenges that we have identified also in the profiles and during the interviews is that technology and also compliance represent still some challenges. Technology because, of course, edge innovation is still in its infancy, and compliance because of the well-known obstacles and problems, issues with, for example, with the GDPR. Finally, when it comes to green IT is an increasingly important topic among the interviews we have conducted, and many cloud service providers are setting ambitious goals when it comes to CO2 neutrality. It is also the main question here is that whether the shift to edge deployment will make the whole infrastructure more or less sustainable. So far, we have not identified a consistent answer to this question, also because many of the interviews we have done have highlighted that the green IT is considered as byproduct in the IT infrastructure development rather than a strategic priority. Nevertheless, the interviews we have conducted have also highlighted the importance of green IT in their developments. So, as you can see, the work we are doing is very much in progress, and we have some objectives. So, by the end of the year, we would like to complete a second release of the European Cloud Computing Portfolio and set up the online catalog to that the community look for and learn from experiences in the cloud computing area. We also aim at completing the Success Stories Guide second release in March 2021. So here is where we really would like to have your feedback, and please get in contact with us to share your experience and to share your success story, because this will allow us to enrich our evidence and the list of cases we are analyzing, and will allow us also to to develop a more structured recommendations into our sphere. Very good. So this was my introduction, and I will now be very happy to introduce the two parallel sessions. So the first one is going to focus on some interesting cases from the public sector, and is going to be moderated by my colleague Massimiliano. For this parallel session, I invite you to stay in this virtual room, while my colleague Carla Arendt will moderate the private sector session, and participants who are interested in participating in this parallel session are invited to click on the link that you will see in the chat and follow the dedicated virtual room. Then at 3, we will reconvene in this room, which will represent the plenary session, and we will hear back from Carla and Max for a wrap up, and we will open a discussion among both the public and private sector speakers and hopefully the audience. So thanks a lot, and I'm gonna give the floor to Max.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, and good afternoon, everybody. Let's give the participants a couple of minutes in case they want to go to Carla's session. Our session is going to be much more fun, but just in case. And I'll start by sharing slides. Here we go. All right, so in this part of the conversation, as Alessandra said, we're gonna dig a little bit deeper and put a face to that number, right? The 65 best practices that we've investigated are actually the result of a number of interviews that we've done. We've bothered a few very nice people to get their input and get a sense of what their experiences are with cloud computing in the private sector, in the public sector in our case, and both from a deployment and a research and innovation perspective. And that is what we're going to do in this panel, right? I have the pleasure to have 4 speakers with me. We will do most of the work. I've only I have to moderate their conversation. So we have Barry Lowry. Barry is the CIO for the Irish government. Hi, Barry. Thank you for being with us. Then we have Professor Reinhard Posch. Hi, Reinhard is the CIO for the Austrian government and many other things still in the academic world as well, very much committed to innovation and the impact on the public sector. We have Martin Diaz-Dulois is the product owner for cloud computing at LOGIUS, which is the digital competence center for the Dutch government. Let's put it that way. Hi, Martin. Thanks for being with us. And then we have Paul Mundt. Paul is the founder and CEO of Adaptant and is representing a very interesting research and innovation project in the context of the European Commission activities and initiatives that is Sodalite, and Paul will talk about some advances at the frontier of technology that they're exploring. So without further ado, let's see what in practice cloud looks like in the public sector. What are the lessons learned? What are the challenges? And I'll give the floor to Reinhard to kick us off with his perspective.
I have to unmute and hopefully you can hear me now. Thank you very much for having me. I just go to the next slide to jump into my few minutes. Cloud as such is not a value. Why the public sector should use it? It's about cost expectations, cost reducing expectation, about agility, and about performance. And this means when it goes to continuity that that the public sector needs provider independent agreed standards, which is not there fully yet. As you see on this and on the next slide, please, we have to cope with various side effects and conditions. Public sector is a multi-stakeholder driven activity. The entities are acting at different speeds, so you cannot plan and roll out, especially not in a federalistic state like ourselves. The services are composed from various entities, even cross-border if you are thinking European. which means that changes in the cloud infrastructures, usually having immediate effect, may pose a special challenge for the public sector. And to all of that comes mobile, where mobile is totally driven by a different scenario. And I'm going to that on my next sector, which my next slide, which is especially focusing on the fact of digital sovereignty. A state or a nation is not like a private entity. And digital sovereignty comes in two flavors. One, which is obvious, resilience. It needs to be absolutely a precondition that no other public or private entity can change or interrupt the service. If that would be the case, it would not be constitution-wise acceptable. And for some of the applications, confidentiality might matter. No third party must be involved in the generation or the use of crypto keys. And just think about that, what that means to present cloud. So there is limitations and there's aspects that must be ensured on the legal, but also, and that's very important on a technical level, because the legal level doesn't go beyond a national entity, and still this has to be ensured throughout. Let me on the next slide go to a slightly different aspect. We are living, or most of us are living in Europe, which means that there are basic requirements to services, and that includes cloud service, even if cloud services are not always aware of that, resulting from these obligations. The single digital gateway, which shall be in place until 2023, is one of these minimum requirements. It needs to be provable and technically clear that a service offered by a member state can meet this. And the other one is the eIDAS regulation, which turns the liability of identification towards member states, not towards the provider. And these two are elements which clearly have to be embedded when it comes to services that are offered via cloud. I'm not only talking about data only in cloud, which is, data repository, which is not a real problem. Like on the next slide, I'm especially pointing on services that are in the cloud. There's great difference between data services in the cloud and services that include activities. Even like simple search, when it comes to sovereignty for relevant applications, anything beyond pure and encrypted data seems to be unfeasible at this point in time. We have no application that runs encrypted. Theoretically, it's possible, but it's not done in practice. Which leads me to my last slide of my 5 minutes, which summarizes what we really need from the public sector. When it comes towards citizens, eIDAS is a must. We are obliged as member states to do that. When it comes towards citizen companies, proper and high quality encryption is a precondition for GDPR compliance. And for critical administration like budget, justice, public health, and many others, sovereignty matters and must be considered upfront, not just something you do later on. Public services have to assume different liability. You cannot back up public service liability by money. It's backed up by constitution and such like. For being fail-safe, most services will therefore require a totally independent second instance, just in case the service provider will not or cannot continue. For services in the cloud, it needs that updates and changes for the provider will not force the public administration to get into action or even stop because some services have changed. Therefore, this continuity must be clearly managed. And a final remark, we are facing challenges, security challenges every day. Like over the last few years, we have seen Meltdown Scepter, and we have seen some similar issues over the last weeks as well. And that must be properly handled as well. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Reinhard. Next speaker is Barry, and I think I was having an interesting conversation yesterday with another member state of the EU, and they were talking about how cloud is often embraced a little bit tactically, particularly public cloud could be seen as a last resort when you have an emergency and you need to scale up something. But in your case, Barry, you've taken quite a strategic approach to use cloud and other tools as well as part of a journey to transforming digitally the government. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Max. And again, we'll just jump quickly to the next slide. So my presentation hopefully complements Reinhard's, but it's focused very much more on the challenges that we were having in Ireland and how we started to move forward into the cloud environment at both a strategic and a practical level. So this is a simple graphical representation of our public service ICT strategy, which was published at Christmas 2015. And I'm sure, like any government, there are similarities. Basically, we wanted our citizens to be able to use digital government services at the time and place convenient to them in using their device of choice. And that could be voice-driven device if it was easier for them. In order to do that, then we had to start to develop consistent and easy to use digital services, which needed to reflect the diversity of our society, including the fact that a growing proportion of our society were non-native English speakers. And so we developed a portal and standards around how we presented information to the public. But of course, critical to all this, and Reinhard mentioned the once only principle, was data. And we made a commitment that we would only collect data once, and we would use data to proactively drive government services. Therein lies the problem, because where we were in 2016 was that many departments and public service bodies had their own databases on their own server farms, in their own computer rooms, which they often called data centers. And we therefore had physical barriers to sharing as well as cultural barriers. And so that became a major challenge of taking forward our strategy. If we can move forward to the next slide, please. At the time, we had discussion with numerous bodies, one of whom was Gartner. And as you can see, Gartner told us that the top 3 objections to public cloud usage in government were security, privacy issues, lack of features, and concerns about vendor lock-in. We actually engaged with a lot of our colleagues, CIO colleagues across Europe, and we were actually finding they had very similar concerns to us and as articulated there. And in fact, Estonia, who would be seen to be one of the more forward-thinking governments in terms of digital, they looked very seriously at a private public hybrid type cloud as being their only way forward. And they decided at the end of it that that would not be possible. And the reason that it would not be possible was because of the issues of control and jurisdiction of data and systems. So if we could jump to the next slide, please. So Max mentioned about how we decided to create policy to try and accelerate the move to the cloud. And last year, we produced what was called the Cloud Computing Advice Note. And as you can see in the quotation from the note, we said that organizations should no longer decide whether to move to the cloud for new or existing systems, but it must be what, how, and when. And that actually caught the imagination of the industry. And so as an example there, a leading Irish indigenous IT company, version 1, produced a booklet and webinar about how public service might adhere to the cloud computing advice note and move to the cloud. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So how have we moved forward with this hybrid type model? Well, we still believe, for many of the reasons outlined by Reinhard, and we'll address again, that we do need to have our own capability. And so a government cloud is a key part of our strategy. What we wanted to do, though, was focus on where we were moving away from. So we're building a state data center, which is outside Dublin, as you can see in the map there, quite a bit outside. That reduces risks around electricity provision and so on. But what we really want to do is focus on where we're moving away from. So we believe cloud technology, where we're using the hardware more efficiently, which is actually much more important than the fabric of the building itself, but also having a properly designed green data center. All of these things together will definitely help us become much greener and more carbon efficient in the provision of government services. But we also see a really important role for public cloud as well. And just as a for instance, I mentioned our portal, gov.ie. That became the go-to place during the worst of the pandemic for information on what was happening with the virus, information on the benefits that a business or member of the public could get, and also a place where industry could make offers to help government in various ways, including PPE. And so what happened there was, as you can see at the bottom, a dramatic increase in access to gov.ie. In fact, nearly a 500% increase in 4 months over the whole of the previous year. And you can see that hits were way up in the millions in that period of time. If our gov.ie had not been on the public cloud, it simply would have fallen over and we would have had real difficulties. And I think this really emphasized the value of using both approaches. If we could go to the next slide, please. But my final comment, still work to be done, though. We actually carried out our own survey to complement the survey that Max and IDC were doing over the last few months. And we found all of the issues that Max has shown in this graphic. We also found an interesting additional one, and that was that government departments not only were concerned about things like security, but it was actually the evidence of it, because obviously government has a very strong audit underpinning. And so just because someone shows you the ISO 27001 certificate doesn't actually mean that they're constantly following all the procedures that they would use to get that certificate in the first place. And so audit is very easy of government premises because the auditor can turn up when they want and see the security and how the systems are managed. It's much more difficult in a cloud environment. So that's one additional concern. So that's really my presentation done, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Barry. Martin, over to you as you're trying to make this as a reality also for the Dutch government with your colleagues.
Yes. So I focused on the core message, why we are focusing on cloud technology, why our work, and it's becoming more agile. So we can go to the next slide and maybe the third already, because thank you. So LOGIUS is an executional body of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and we exploit services such as the digital identity for citizens, but also for entrepreneurs. We do digital messaging for the message box for Dutch citizens, e-delivery, so that's for customs when on XBRL messaging systems. And we also have a center of standards looking at the open standards that we want to use in Holland. It's important to know that I'm within the operations level mostly, and maybe to give you an impression, in Holland there's no real central policy yet on cloud computing. Cloud computing is being used by lesser privacy focused governmental bodies already. More open data applications are already in the public cloud, but the things that we do at LOGIUS are too precarious for policymakers to put it in public clouds. I've been working in the private sector mostly, but now 6 years in the government, and I've been doing a lot of work with digital mandates, so enacting in name of another person in the digital domain, which is very hard. And now since 1.5 years, we are building our own private cloud. So you can go to the next slide, Max. So we had motives to start building our own private cloud. The changes are going very rapidly. That's what we see. So we want to be able to implement faster and more frequent changes on the applications that we deliver. For this, we also adapted our organization. So our complete organization, which has around 500 people working, we adapted the skilled agile framework. So all the teams are part of a release train, what we call, and we plan our work in 3-month increments, and it's all transparent, so we can work with all the stakeholders, which are the tax office, the Ministry of Health. They all want us to build stuff, and the demand is higher than we can produce, so we have to make transparent what is priority and adds the most value. And also to be able to implement faster and more frequent, we want to reuse and move from a monolithic system architecture to microservices. So, and then the cloud technology comes around, which would enable to enable all those motives. Cloud is a very useful tool to achieve it. Next slide, Max. So what we're really trying to do is and I have a DevOps operational level. So quick view, what we mean by it, and what we think it will improve the innovation, the quality, it will reduce the changes on errors. It will help if you share repositories, even in a close organization, having lots of teams working on lots of applications, because you see that all the applications are looking in central registers, and basically all municipalities, they have their own identity as a municipality, but if you look at the services they provide to their citizens, they're basically all the same. The transaction that a customer needs is most of the times for all the municipalities the same. So if you can cooperate more and reuse more, it is more effective, and it will reduce IT costs as well. Next slide, Max. So why do we think it was a time to do it now? Because there's different opinions. If you look at some formal bodies, they say it's not fully matured yet, this type of technology. That's a great debate, I think. At the moment, we think that it is a good time to start using it, because the various components you need are there. You need continuous integration, you need version control, you need mature containers, you will need infrastructure as a code, and you want to have a lot of automated testing on various, on code quality, on security, and so forth. All those things are there and can be used. Next slide, Max. So if we look at what we're doing, we outsource also quite a bit of work. Our data centers are outsourced, but we are the owners, we look at it, so it's fairly closed system. The same with our infrastructure, which is put in our private floors in the data centers. So these contracts have to be renewed every now and then, which means you have to change suppliers. With that in mind, we really look at open sources. So we look at the decisions that we make to use components. We look at the Cloud Native Computing Federation landscape. We want to stay agnostic because you want to be able to run your working code on as many Kubernetes platforms as possible. Some have OpenShift, some have Rancher, some can be more bearer. What we're doing now is to stimulate co-creation. We organize a lot of events. We do a lot of knowledge sharing. We want to be as open as possible to also train the teams, which have to start learning to work differently as well. Cloud is not a silver bullet. I would like, that was my last sentence. It will ask a lot of attention to a lot of other activities if you really want to do it well. Next slide, Max. I think it was that. Yeah,
yep.
That's maybe one note. On very short notice, coming month, we will release our code on GitLab. And this is working code by which you can roll out a complete tool set, enabling teams to work with CI/CD, with backup and security and so forth. And we invite any team interested in working with us to improve this code.
Thank you very much, Martin. So from strategy, we now went into the tools and the orchestration and deployment capabilities. Paul, why don't you take us to the next layer in terms of what you're doing at the frontier of technology innovation?
Okay, thank you. So I'm representing the Sodalite project, which is basically a Horizon 2020 project, which is focused on how do we deal with orchestration and application development and deployment across heterogeneous infrastructures. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So what Sodalite is effectively it's a system where we provide tools that allow basically different stakeholders in the application development process and the deployment process, as well as from the legal side, to basically get involved, codify requirements from the application point of view, and deploy this into basically heterogeneous environments. And this can be everything from HPC, so high performance computing resources, cloud, and as well as edge-based systems, and basically anything in between. The main thing here is that we build on top of the existing infrastructure as code methodology and basically apply the same sort of thing from the application modeling point of view. So the important thing is that we're able to harness requirements both from the application side and match this up with the capabilities on the infrastructure side in order to basically come up with a runtime blueprint that can be deployed and orchestrated. And then apply optimizations to that basically as the system is operational. So if we can go to the next slide. There's basically three main use cases that we're looking at within Sodalite. And they each have their own unique problems and unique ways that they solve their problems using Sodalite solutions. So the first one that we have is a water scarcity use case. This is basically using imagery from mountain ranges, looking at snowpacks and trying to determine basically the residual amount of water that's left in the snowpacks. And this is something that's very much a data processing issue. It's very much GPU driven. And it's also very much on the HPC side. So these sorts of problems are the sort of things that Sodalite does quite well with. And this is basically something where you have an example of where you have to go not just to the cloud level, but you also have to use HPC, you also have to use GPUs in order to solve the problem. So the orchestration really has to go in a cross environment case. You have the vehicle IoT case, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail afterwards. But the main issue that we have in the vehicle case is that we have edge gateways which are installed in vehicles, which of course drive around. So the key challenge that you have there is the vehicle is not stationary. which means that it can move, especially between countries. And when that happens from a data service point of view that's being delivered into the vehicle, that's leveraging vehicle and personal data, geolocational data, biometric data, etc., this is subject to changes in the compliance requirements, as well as the audit requirements and other things. Because otherwise we may have not necessarily a free flow of data, but we have very much a cross-border data transfer situation if part of the workload is on the cloud in one country and the vehicle is now physically in a different one. And these are the sorts of things that have to be considered really in a runtime case, especially when we look at things like GDPR, which is subject to derogations on a member state level, or which may have intersection with other national level legislation when we look at different data types and so on. So being able to really dynamically reconfigure the deployment, both from the application and the infrastructure level, is something that's very critical in order to maintain these compliance and audit requirements on a per member state basis. And the last use case is the in silico clinical trials. This is again a very classical HPC issue, a typical workload. But again, here part of the issue is that it has very strict performance requirements that have to be met. So when this is going into a mixed or hybrid cloud environment, for example, we always have to make sure that these performance targets are basically continually addressed. So all of these basically rely on some degree of monitoring and reconfiguration in order to make sure that the workloads can continue unimpeded. So if we can go to the last slide, please, or the next one. So this is a bit more of a drill down into how we solve this the challenge in the case of the vehicle IoT use case. So the way that this works architecturally is that we basically have the IDE at the top level where the application developer can come in and codify application requirements. This can also be SLAs, other application needs, QoS parameters, things of this nature. And of course, then they have to model both the application deployment and the infrastructure requirements. And then from this, there's basically repositories that can be drawn upon, which generate a deployment blueprint. This gets handed off to the orchestrator, which can then orchestrate both across cloud, edge, as well as HPC, which we're not using in this instance, but is also possible. And then from the cloud, we get this deployment to the edge basis, which of course is also then a heterogeneous resource itself, as it may have multiple accelerators and things of this nature. Information about the deployment basically goes into a knowledge base, which is drawn on by our refactorer. And the refactorer itself is basically triggered by environmental changes. So when we look at things like changes in country, or we look at cases where, say, a driver changes their consent preferences, or even the driver of the vehicle changes, thermal tolerances can be exceeded. This is very, very problematic for edge-based accelerators, where if the temperature gets too high, you just start to get inference failures rather than a service lapse. And so these sorts of things need to be mitigated in advance. Or you may also have the case where the vehicle itself is a multi-user system. So if you are using your GPU for obstacle detection, and then somebody in the back seat decides that they want to play a video game, now you have a real problem. But how do you make sure that your obstacle detection continues to work while you don't get a mutiny within the vehicle? So these sorts of things are also very important. So when we look at this, we say, okay, well, we've got all of this information about the deployment within the knowledge base. We have the alerting of this sort of environmental change, which has been triggered at the vehicle level. And then from this, the refactor is basically notified and comes up with basically a deployment improvement or alteration recommendation for an updated blueprint. And the critical thing here is that it has enough situational awareness from the monitoring and the environmental data that we can do a look aside into things like the infrastructure as code validation and compare this also against codified compliance rules. So this is also an area where you can get your legal teams involved, and you can say, okay, well, what does this really mean from us from a data flow point of view, from a compliance point of view within this situational context? And then you can evaluate that and modify the blueprint accordingly until you have something that works. And then, of course, anytime that there's an evaluation or a decision based on that, you also have a corresponding audit log, which is generated, so that at any time, if there is a misprediction or whatever else, you can go back and see what the reason for this was. So the key thing here is that basically as the vehicle continues to move between borders, you really have the tooling there that's capable of basically dynamically reconfiguring this at runtime based on these environmental changes. And we think certainly this is going to be a very big issue when we look at services that are not restricted in their data flows, or we look at any kind of cross-border scenario. And we think that's definitely going to be more problematic as more different types of data get opened up. So we have the GDPR, which is good for some personal data. There's a free flow regulation, which is fine for non-personal data, rather, which is fine for those parts. But of course, we still have many other types of data sets that people are increasingly interested in drawing upon for the development of their services, which are still subject to national level regulation or derogations. And these are things that we always have to be mindful of when we're trying to deploy into this kind of environment. So next slide, please. So this is basically just the core information about the project. All of the components that we've discussed are available as open source. We have another release coming up in the next couple of months. Everything is available on GitHub, and we would invite people to take a look at what's there, and please reach out to us if you have any questions or are interested in collaborating. And we look forward to hearing from you and working with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. So now we have a few minutes to ask some questions, to dig a little bit deeper. And I invite the people that are in the breakout to raise their hand or put a question in the chat. So maybe one quick question that I have for Barry and Reinhard. I think Martin raised the point around organizational change, right? So he said the cloud is also part of a transition towards a new type of delivery and deployment model, towards Agile and DevOps and so forth and so on. How do you see that in your context, respectively, in Ireland and in Austria? How is the government able to embrace new skills and new competencies and new ways of working? And maybe how the situation we are living in it now has accelerated some of that in terms of being critical. Barry, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess we would turn it around the other way and say that the whole concept of digital government is a different way of doing things anyway. You know, if e-government was computerizing the processes that you had, digital government is thinking of them in a very different way. So to do that, you really do need an agile approach. You need to sit in a room with the business and with the internal technology people and with the partners, and you need to build something there. So that actually does create, by itself, start to create a completely different approach to how you do things. And so we're moving very much away from the traditional waterfall, you know, specification, out to procurement, pick a contractor, et cetera, to trying to be much more agile about how we actually procure and deliver solutions.
Thank you, Reinhard.
Well, it is a real challenge. And the basic reason why it's a real challenge is cloud is not the end of the time and not the end of the world. We will have next approaches. And cloud is pushing us into a situation where we get less, where we need less people, because all the operation is decentralized. But we still need to, or we even need to increase the knowledge and the know-how so that we can cope with the future development. And I think that the big challenge in terms of the change is that we have resources, human resources and knowledge resources that can judge and that can manage the transition into cloud, but also the transition as cloud changes and as new situations come up, may be that in the area of what security, what data protection, what other things mean in cloud, but also what other approaches might might mean in distributed computation, etc.
Great, thank you, Reinhard. I think there's an interesting comment in the chat from Yuri Delamar at Deutsche Telekom in terms of one of the drivers of federating some of these resources at the European level can also be the environmental sustainability, right? And instead of fragmenting too much the investment in data centers, if we can federate a little bit more and become efficient, it will yield better results. And I don't know, Yuri, if you're there, you want to articulate that a little bit more before I ask the panelists to comment further on your question.
Yeah, thank you for picking this up. So, yes, to be frank and direct, I think some of the comments made in the first presentations, I think, are simply overly conservative. Yeah, if we look at what is already being done today, what is best practice today, I would have expected a bit more of this in this session. But that's maybe because I'm from the private sector. Yeah, of course, we have totally different skill and examples already that prove that every day. But if I look to the EU agenda and especially the sustainability elements in the new agenda, I think we definitely have to change some thinking radically. Yeah? Not talking about only the transformation of applications that's necessary and how to get from A to B. And I fully agree with some of the statements in that it's still work to be done, yes. But this is going to stay for a very, very long time. Yeah, I always compare cloud computing to the energy grid. Yeah, we invented the energy grid 100 years ago, and it is still there, and it is still working. It has been improved. It has been complemented with new types of energy, renewable energy that we're now feeding into the grid. But the grid is still there, and cloud computing will still be there, I believe, in 50 or 100 years, because it's how we do it. Especially how we do it now with the combination of public clouds and edge computing in the future. It will be super efficient, and it will be the only thing that we can sustain, yeah, with the data amounts that are increasing. So what I think what radically has to be changed is really addressing sustainability. How can we make sure that Europe will not be the one with the biggest carbon footprint in the IT industry in the world? How can we stop this fragmentation? How can we stop that new data centers are being built every day or new private clouds being built every day when we know we can simply solve it by federating or by building combinations of building blocks that we already have available?
Yuri, can I comment a little bit on this topic from what I see? I think there's a couple of things. If I look at the capacity that we use, is actually we have a contract with the private sector data center supplier. So we're reusing that investment there. It's our private room. And then we have another contract with another private party, which is tendered to build, according to our specifications, a hardware setup. So where I work, we're not building our own data center, but it's organized in such a way that we consider the private a private cloud. So that's one thing. The other thing, what is hard, what I see is that this is still a bit new for policymakers, but it's also quite new for teams that have to work with it. The way of capacity management, the way that can go, what you see is that in the old world and compared to the cloud world, we really see that teams have to get used to how you use actual capacity instead of claiming capacity which you're not using. So, and what you stress is true. So if there's a vast economy of scale in this area within Europe, then it will be very, very economically interesting to use that better. But what I see in my nearest environments, or I say is that it's relatively new for decision makers. And plus the fact of that, basically, if you drill down, we have contracts where we buy computing power at the moment. So I also see a complexity there, because we have suppliers. So if what would happen if we start addressing computing power, for instance, in Ireland, then our supplier would say, hey, I have a contract with you. I thought I was your supplier. So there's also some thought that has to go into that, I think.
Yeah, I think Reinhard and Barry want to comment. Reinhard, you go first.
Unfortunately, I have a sharp light at 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
But I think this is a very interesting and principled question. Well, at the first moment, the first thought, computing has not been here 100 years ago. How do we know what will be here in 100-year future? We will have to face future innovation in the same way as we face cloud. And the principal question here is, who is the driver? Is it the society or is it the technology? And some of these things will have to change if we really embrace them, have to change the constitution. We are not allowed to outsource police. State power is not outsourceable, at least according to our constitution. And other things cannot be outsourced. Unless we change this in the constitution, we have principal limitations in sovereignty, and that's one of the reasons why I stressed on sovereignty in my presentation.
Yeah, if I could just add, Max, yeah, I can understand why private sector would say we're being overly conservative, but at the end of the day, it's about where we're moving away from. And, you know, I thought I illustrated in the presentation, even using the example of Estonia, the only way you get people to move away from having their own data centers or their own computer rooms is build something where the data is still under the stewardship of the government, which is the key thing. And this is what the people want, obviously. So government must reflect what its society wants. The other point I would make is if we had been overly ambitious, there's a thin line between ambitious and reckless. And for example, if we had thrown our lot in with the hyperscalers 4 years ago when we did our strategy, well, then one would question the logic of that in the context of some of the things Europe are doing at the moment with Gaia X and the cloud declaration. So when the target is ever moving, government do have to be cautious, because government have to represent the will and the needs of all stakeholders, which of course includes the private sector.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. I know Paul wants to make a comment. We'll take it in the plenary because we're rejoining the 2 breakouts. I want to thank Reinhard because I know you have to leave. Thank you very much for joining the panel and contributing to our discussions.
Thank you.
Bye, Reinhard.
Bye.
All right. So, Paul, why don't you start with your comment? I think Yuri also called up the point about the cloud and the edge, and the work that you're doing also is very much in that direction and connecting the dots between the two. So what's your view?
Well, I think the topic about what's the most energy efficient or what's computationally efficient, I think this is a very important consideration, especially for cloud providers where they're going to look to increase utilization rates for, make sure that they're getting the most money for the resources that are available and so on. You see this sort of trend already economically with spot pricing and things like this is already within the utility computing model. I think the important thing that we see as well is that, well, every cloud is not homogeneous, so you have heterogeneous resources. There are cases where, say, you want to train a new machine learning model. Well, yes, you could do this in a plain CPU-bound workload within the cloud, but this would be horribly inefficient. If you could do the same thing with GPUs, or if you can buy a short period of time on a supercomputer, of course, you can do this much, much faster. So the important consideration is not just, can I get my work done with the resource that's there, but actually finding the best fit resources in terms of what's most efficient for the workload. And that's always a consideration, not just financially, but also in terms of the overall energy efficiency.
Right. I want to thank Martin. I know you also have to go to your next commitment. Thank you very much for joining the conversation.
Thank you for organizing it, Max. Good luck.
Thanks. All right, I think we're ready to be joined back into the plenary, and then we'll have a few more discussion points. Let's see where we are. Alessandra, are we back in the plenary with the other people joining?
I think Carla is not yet in, and maybe we should at least wait for her.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just wait for her to come. Yes.
All right. Maybe one final comment that we can pick up then again on the conversation. I think Martin was mentioning capacity planning that becomes more complicated. What we've seen in our research is that the new data centers, no matter how fragmented they are more energy efficient. There's no doubt about that. But the demand for consuming resources is increasing. So I'm not sure whether if we federate everything and use the data centers that we have in an efficient manner, we'll soon hit a threshold where we need more capacity again, and we will consume more energy. So there's that aspect as well.
Max, I think if, and this I tell based on the studies, first of all, I think we need to be a bit positive. I mean, there is a lot of negativism about the energy consumed by data center. But if you consider, for example, according to the Moore law, the capacity of computation that we reached in the last years, and compare it to the growth of energy, so if you make the ratio between increased energy consumption and increased capacity of computing, you will see that basically we are much more cheaper than what we were 50, 20, 10 years ago per providing the same computation. What I think it is a bit of a challenge is to understand what happens when you cross the border of the data center, because understanding what energy you are consuming inside the data center, it's a black box. You put something that measure at the entrance, and you know what's pumping in terms of energy, and you know what is the efficiency of your server, theirs, and all the network equipment, whatever. But now we are talking about the cloud edge continuum. So it's putting together 20 different actors to create a small continuum, and maybe you have clue of what's happening only in a couple of places. So what's in the middle in terms of energy consumption is lost. So now, I mean, you have people claiming that the edge will improve energy efficiency. This is true only if certain factors are true. And this might not hold so much, because one of the things we saw in the analysis is that most of the energy consumption, it's not for the backbone network, but for the edge network, for the radio network. So this won't change, even if you use the edge.
Yep. I think, thanks Federico for the comment.